Hey everybody, it's the Mortgage King, and today's topic of the conversation is appraisals. And so you already know how I do it. Whenever questions come into me, especially common questions, that's going to be the topic of the conversation. And of course, the whole purpose is just to edify the masses as much as possible. So when it comes to appraisals, most people think that appraisals are part of the lender, kind of attached to the lender. The lender is sending their own appraiser out to do an appraisal. But that's far from the truth. And so I hope this kind of provides some clarity around appraisal. So first, what's an appraisal? For those who don't know, if you already know, just bear with me. This is just for people who don't know. An appraisal is when an appraiser goes out to a property to determine its value. That's pretty much the easiest, most layman term way I can explain it. So you need an appraiser to go out to the property and figure out what the value of that property is. And on this appraisal report, it's gonna have a ton of info. It's gonna have what other recent sales have been. It's gonna have data and information providing the buyer why the appraiser says that the value is what it says. All right, so that appraisal report is gonna have a ton of things. They're also gonna check there's going to be photos of the actual property on the appraisal report. So there's going to have it's just filled with a ton of info. But the whole main purpose, I can maybe go into a more detailed video on appraisals. It's pretty complicated for the average person to read. But for someone like me or for your loan officer, it's pretty, if they have experience, I'm sure they know how to read it and they can explain certain things, any questions that you might have. But the whole purpose of it is just to provide the value. And the bank is going to use that appraisal report to determine the value of the property. Just a quick side note, lenders are only going to lend based on the appraisal value. So if, for example, you're trying to purchase a property that the seller is selling for $500,000 and an appraiser goes out and they actually determine the value to be $400,000, the lender is only going to lend on $400,000. And if you want to continue with that sale, either the seller has to bring down the price to the appraised value, or you would have to come out of pocket, not finance the difference to meet the seller and give the seller what they want. So the appraisal is kind of a big deal during a purchase transaction. Also a refinance. Whenever you refinance on an FHA conventional non-QM loan, you're going to do an appraisal to determine the value. They're always going to determine the value of the property on a purchase or a refinance. So the appraisal is a big deal. Now, what most people think about appraisals is that the lender is sending out an appraiser that they know, that they can speak to, or that works on behalf of the bank to determine the value. And this is a misconception. Since the 2008 crash, the crash that happened in 2008, where mortgage notes, pretty long story short, there was a huge market crash. I don't want to get too into detail of what happened during the market crash, but there was a ton of things that happened. Stated income home loans. There were people who couldn't afford homes that were getting approved for homes they couldn't afford. Values sank, and there was just a huge real estate crash. There was tons of homes that were up for foreclosure. Nonetheless, since that, it did a ton of damage to the economy, where the feds came out and they made a ton of rules. As a matter of fact, loan officers back then didn't even have to get licensed. Now they have to be licensed. And now they came out with mortgage insurance. And so a part of all the rules and regulations they came out with because of the 2008 crash, so that we won't experience another crash like what happened in 2008, upon all those rules, they came out with the rules of the appraiser. So one thing that would happen during that time is lenders were able to communicate with appraisers. And so if a seller was selling a property for $500,000, the lender would just say, hey, I need the appraisal report to say $500,000. It needs to be worth this much. And even if it wasn't worth that much, the appraisal report would come back and say, hey, it's $500,000, even when the true value wasn't. And so it would be manipulated, and lenders had access to do that. Real estate agents had access to do that. They would just call the appraiser. Oh, I know this appraiser. And every sale would be a successful sale because there wasn't any issues with the appraisal. It would always be at value of whatever the seller was selling at. And in order to put a stop to that, what the government did, a part of their underwriting guidelines, rules and regulations, is there has to be third-party appraisers. And this is how it works. Every lending company has something called an AMC. That's a short acronym. So basically what it's for is it's an AMC that governs a different amount of appraisal companies. Most people stop at 5, most people stop at 3. Most people just have like 2 appraisal companies, but every lender has an AMC. And whenever the buyer pays for an appraisal report, it might look like it's coming from the lender, but it's really a payment that goes to the AMC. And the AMC is picking the appraisal company at random, and the appraisal company is picking the appraiser. And the lender can't communicate directly with the appraiser at all. It's forbidden that a lender could even speak to an appraiser. So oftentimes a listing agent or a buyer's agent might say, hey, do you have the contact information for the appraiser? Can you speak to the appraiser really quick? We can't do that. So it's completely off limits, and we just can't speak to them at all, because that's what the rule has implemented, so that we can avoid any manipulation with appraisal reports. So for those who this is new info to, lenders cannot speak to an appraiser. We can communicate through the AMC system. So if anything has to be updated or whatever the case is, we can send it to the appraisal management company, and the appraisal management company can speak to the appraiser. And that's just how it works. So if there's anything that needs to be updated, we just speak to the appraisal management company, the AMC. And the AMC communicates as a mediator between the lender and the appraiser. Now, sometimes that's just to stop the lender. Sometimes a real estate agent can also speak to appraisers, because the appraiser is going to reach out to the listing agent and ask them to have access to the home. So a real estate agent has more access to an appraiser than the lender does, even though the lender is sending out your payment link for the appraisal and all that good stuff. They have more leeway to communicate with them, because the lender has to say, hey, I'm coming on this day, I need access to the property, etc., etc. They have their number now. Lenders don't have that luxury. So the whole purpose of this video is just to let people know how appraisals work, who sends them, and basically to clarify, lenders don't have access to the appraisers, and the appraiser is not part of the lending company. They're a completely separate company. They're an appraisal company, and we communicate through them through the appraisal management company, the AMC. We don't have direct access to just pick up the phone and call up an appraiser, or at least that's how it should be. That's what the laws and regulations state. And in a nutshell, that's basically it. So if there's anytime an appraisal comes low and everyone disagrees, or not just everyone, if the seller disagrees and says, no, the value of my property should be X amount, it shouldn't be less, and you do have the right to dispute that. Now, when you dispute, it's got to be pretty valid. It can't just be these comparable sales that you picked from another block, bigger than your home and all that kind of good stuff. It's got to be pretty legit, and the way to combat an appraisal value is by way of a dispute. You fill out a certain form, put your reasons why you're disputing and what comparable sales they believe the appraiser should use to determine the value of the subject property, and you would return that in, and either the value changes, either the appraiser agrees or they disagree. And they have the right to disagree because their license is also on the line. So a part of the rules and regulation that happened in 2008, now appraisers are licensed appraisers. They have to have a certain license. And if too much funky things are going on, or if they send in an appraisal report that really doesn't have legitimate comparable sales or anything reasonable, then they can have a couple of strikes on their license or completely lose their license. And so they're also protecting their license and their ability to do business. So whenever we send in a dispute by way of the appraisal management company sends the dispute over to the appraiser reads it, sends his reply back, either an updated report or a dispute back saying that he's not going to use your comparable sales. because of these following reasons, and they state why. But yeah, that basically concludes my video. I hope you guys find this information of value. Never forget, the lender doesn't communicate directly, or the lender, whoever your lender is, they are separate from the appraisal company. So the lender is separate from the appraisal company. Even though the lender is working with the appraisal company, they're not from the lending company. They're a completely third party. They determine your value. They come up with the report. And if you ever want to dispute it, the lender doesn't communicate directly. They just don't pick up the phone and speak directly to the appraiser. There's a certain way to do it. You would dispute it on a form, send it into the appraisal management company, who works as a liaison, as a mediator to the appraiser, and they'll validate your dispute. But they're not one and the same. It might look that way, it might appear that way, but they're not one and the same. The appraisal company is completely separate from the lender. All right, so it's the Mortgage King, so you know who said it.